Nashville, Phoenix. It's not up quite yet. It's yes, it is.
So what?
So I'm having a doubt about the whole process. I'm not really sure if I believe in it.
You're having doubts. That's normal. That's what we're
All right, we're live. All right, everyone, welcome to West Nashville Phoenix Lodge. Thank you so much for coming out to our monthly educational series. Every fourth Monday of the month, barring something crazy, we have an education night, and we are very lucky tonight to have Brother Ryan Driver, 32nd degree KCCH, speak to us tonight about belief, conviction, and doubt. So without further ado, Brother Ryan.
Well, good evening, and Ryan, thank you for the introduction. I don't know how lucky anyone is to have me here tonight, but you can tell me afterwards. Don't worry, the logic problems won't be that bad. So as Ryan mentioned, tonight I wanted to talk about belief, conviction, and doubt. It is my sincere conviction, after observing humanity and interactions throughout many, many years now, that most of us are really not quite aware of the beliefs, all of the assumptions that we make in our conversations with others and our convictions about politics or religion or anything of the sort. I think that most of the time, most people find themselves arguing a point without ever having truthfully analyzed it and gone into it to really take a look at what's being assumed, what's being believed, and what might not necessarily be barest call. So that's kind of what I want to get into tonight. I want to see if I can help everybody maybe understand and be aware of the beliefs and the convictions that we may have, and why doubt is not a bad thing at all, but really rather a pretty good thing. So we'll get into a little bit of skepticism momentarily. But first off, and let me just say, I want this night to be a little bit informal. I want this to be a little bit conversational. If anyone has a question, ask in the middle of the presentation. That's fine. We can get sidetracked on a tangent. That's perfectly fine with me. So if anybody has anything that pops into mind, don't hesitate to bring it up, and we'll get on with it. So the first question that I have for everybody is, what is belief? Can I see a show of hands about how many people believe they know what it means to believe something? Okay, that's fair. Some of you a little bit ahead of the curve. Why do we believe the things that we believe? What exactly are they? Where do they come from? Why is it that we feel compelled, sometimes even subconsciously, to adopt this belief or that belief or the other belief? Well, we have different kinds of beliefs. We probably have more than that, but I'm going to focus on two. And those have gone by many names throughout many different philosophers. One of my favorites, Jean-Francois Lyotard, actually wrote an entire treatise on this subject for narrative knowledge and scientific knowledge. I'm going to simplify that down a little bit, and we're going to talk about reason and faith. At first glance, those two things don't usually get bantered about much in the same conversation. But that's kind of sad, right? And a lot of people that get very wrapped up into reason and predicate their lives based on all things rational often fail to really appreciate the benefits that faith can bring into someone's life. Equally, people that are completely absorbed in their faith oftentimes neglect the crucialness of reason in the decision-making process and in your life. So what exactly is reason? Well, it's using methods that are data-driven. So when we're reasoning, we take something that we can objectively confirm this exists, and then we make decisions about it, conclusions, based on its properties, what we can observe, and what we have reason to believe. This produces predictable results. Obviously, this is very good for the next bullet point here, which is the scientific method. The scientific method is probably the most well-known form of reason. And that actually came out of 17th and 18th century Enlightenment philosophers, particularly David Hume, writing empiricism and the method. I'm sure everyone's heard of that. So then we have faith on the other hand. So what exactly is faith-based knowledge? Well, as a religion teacher that I had in, I want to say 8th grade at St. Henry, said, well, faith is believing without seeing. This is a very simplistic definition. It's not incorrect. It's completely correct, but it's a little bit simple. So I wanted to analyze that a little bit more and look at it. And so with reason, we can get predictable results. With faith, we can also get predictable results. They're a different kind of predictable. But we do see clear things when we look at people who exemplify a life of faith. One of these things is a sense of spiritual centeredness. Most of the people I know who are very strong in their faiths, whether that be the Christian faith or Muslim or Jewish or Hindu or whatnot, definitely have a very close relationship with what they know as God. What we know as God might be a little different, but ultimately kind of getting to the same place. So you get a lot of narrative wisdom in this as well. The wisdom of stories, the wisdom of metaphors, of parables. Think all the parables that Christ taught in the New Testament. Those would be considered narrative knowledge. So one point about faith that I want to make up front before we get too awful far into it, and that is that faith and reason are separate. They use different ideas to get at where they're going, and they don't really mix per se. So faith can be said to be inherently irrational. Now, take a deep breath. Irrationality is not necessarily a bad thing, as we're going to talk about. A little irrationality is cool if you know what you're doing with it. So let's talk about rationalism versus faith-based cosmology. Does everybody know what cosmology is? It's essentially just the view and study of the world around you that forms your concept of existence, your concept of reality. It's a little more than that, but for the purposes of the presentation, that's where we're going to keep it. So what does rational really mean? Well, rational kind of denotes the use of reason to construct truth statements, logical statements. So when making a rational statement, we use all kinds of different tools to do that. The biggest one is absolutely logic. Now, everybody who's watched an episode of Star Trek probably has heard the word logic at least once. If you know anything about Mr. Spock, he happens to be one of my personal favorites, big fan. And so from a younger age, I was kind of interested in what this logic was. What do you do with it? How does this work? Is it just saying things that make sense? Because, man, I can do that all day long. Well, it turns out it's a little bit more than that. We're about to get into some of that. Some other forms of rational expression would be mathematics. John, I'm going to pick on you because I know you love mathematics. Have you ever found in math a situation where an equation produced a result that you didn't expect it to, that didn't add up, that was rational? Have you ever seen that? Have you ever seen 2 + 2 = 5? Right? Doesn't happen. So we can say that the results predicted from mathematics are rational results. Doesn't mean we always get it right. I mean, just ask Isaac Newton. I'm sure Isaac and Albert Einstein sitting in a bar together would probably have some great conversations. I wish I could have seen that. So mathematics, science, the scientific theory or scientific methods, and think about scientific theories as well. This is actually really interesting. Scientific theories are rational, but cannot be taken as absolute. Again, going back to Newtonian physics, we have a way of using rational expression and mathematics to completely accurately describe the way the world runs and operates in the way that they understood it in the 17th and 18th centuries. Well, fast forward a little bit, we got some better tools. We started to use those better tools to look out there. And we started to see some things that don't add up. Well, is the universe wrong or was Isaac Newton wrong? Well, I think Isaac was wrong. So, whereas once upon a time his theory produced results that are absolutely, completely accurate, his theories of motion as it's being acted upon by the force of gravity is still pretty accurate. But it didn't work once we got off the planet. Once the world that we could observe as an out there became bigger and we could see more of it, we could understand more of it, we had to have something different. So Einstein comes along, general relativity, special relativity. That explains a lot of the things that fell apart with Newton's model. Einstein's model, in turn, fell apart when it came to quantum mechanics. So all of this just to say, a scientific theory should never be assumed to have complete information or be completely, absolutely accurate. I know the scientists in the room, I hope, would agree with me on that. So that's an important thing to just kind of file away in the back of your head. There has been a trend that you all have probably noticed in today's day and age, where non-scientists love to use science to justify their beliefs. Kind of ridiculous. Science was never meant to justify a belief. Science was only really meant to describe things. Like, hey, we see this thing over here. Well, what can we figure out about it? What can we do with this? It was never meant to justify. It was never meant to be confirmation bias. So that's an important thing to remember going on into it. So now going back to logic being kind of the first form of logical, reasonable, rational expression. Logic came to us mostly from, at least in the Western world, mostly from the Greeks. We have the Milesians, the Pre-Socratics, Pythagoras, Socrates, Aristotle, these wonderful gentlemen to thank for the study of logic. They were the first to really start putting statements into conditional forms. And logic as a science, ergo mathematics, is based on solid premises and conclusions. The conclusion must be in conjunction with the premises. The premises must support the conclusion. I'm going to give you guys a few examples, and bear with me, this is going to get a little bit cerebral. But in looking at logical expression, one of the common ones in terms of conditional statements, a conditional statement is an if-then statement, is if P, then Q. P, therefore Q. What this means is P and Q are just random numbers. They're placeholders for whatever premise or whatever bit that you want to plug into a statement. So we won't get into much of that. I want to keep this conceptual. So if P, then Q. That means if P is the case, then it follows that Q must be the case. Well, P is the case, therefore we know that Q is the case. If not P, then not Q. Not P, therefore not Q. Couple other forms of this would look like if and only if P, then Q. P, therefore Q. Or not P, therefore not Q. If P or Q, then Z. Q, therefore Z. Using conditional statements like this, we can begin to analyze argumentation. And when we analyze argumentation, we can start to determine whether or not such an argument is considered valid or cogent. The difference between those two has to do with whatever reasoning you're employing at the time. That would be deductive reasoning or inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning, think Sherlock Holmes, taking a bunch of little clues and then constructing a grand scenario. Inductive reasoning, think, is the sun going to rise tomorrow? Well, that's a future event, so we can't predict it with absolute certainty. But it's risen every single day for as long as people can remember and as long as we have recorded history. So there's no reason to believe the sun won't rise tomorrow. That's an example of an inductive argument. So a valid argument is a deductively sound argument, and a cogent argument is a sound inductive argument. So now there's a very important thing that we have here in logic, and this is where I'm getting at. This is what I want you guys to start becoming aware of. Logical fallacies. Now there are a million informal logical fallacies, and there are several formal logical fallacies. We're not going to get into all that. I'm just going to give you all a few common examples so that you can start maybe learning how to recognize these when they come up. And believe me, if you watch the news, they come up at least a dozen times a night. So you'll get plenty of practice. So what is fallacious reasoning? Does anybody know? Does anybody have an idea of what a logical fallacy would be? Awesome. Don't everybody answer at once now.
I know it.
Go for it, Chris.
Post hoc, ergo propter hoc is the Latin term. After that, therefore, because of that.
Exactly. Yep. That is a great example.
Can you repeat what he said?
I don't actually know that one. So, Chris, would you like to speak up so that?
Sorry, I didn't hear you, Warren.
Could you just say it again?
Yeah, it's called post hoc, ergo propter hoc.
Yeah.
It's like something I remembered from Latin years ago. After that, therefore, because of that, like my father died after drinking a cup of tea. Therefore, the cup of tea killed my father.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
The two may have nothing to do with
Like a hindsight.
So another way of saying it is that causation does not equal causation. So, and that was actually on my list. So good call. Another one of the most common, probably the most common, is the ad hominem fallacy. Everybody ever heard of that? Awesome. The ad hominem fallacy in Latin literally means to the man, as opposed to the argument. So let's say I make an argument. This is me making a big argument. Y'all says, you can't trust that argument. That Ryan Driver, he doesn't know a dang thing. He would know logic if it bit him on the rear end. That's not a valid argument. That does not address my argument. That attacks me as a person. That's saying because I have an undesirable trait, therefore my argument is invalid. Well, that's lunacy. Every argument, no matter who makes it, where it comes from, what their background might or might not be, every argument must be treated as an argument. Not whoever said it, it doesn't really matter. If the argument is correct, it stands on its own. If the argument is fallacious, it falls apart on its own. It doesn't matter if George Washington made it or, the homeless guy down under the street on 2nd Avenue. So don't attack the arguer, attack the argument. That's a big one. One of my favorites, the no true Scotsman. Has anybody ever heard of it? It's kind of everybody knows that one. You just don't know that you know that one. So the no true Scotsman fallacy, actually, it's called the no true Scotsman fallacy because of how the argument happened, which I don't remember all the exact specifics, but I'll give you an example. Well, so what are we going to have to drink with dinner tonight? Well, I think we're going to have sweet tea since we're in the South, and Southerners love sweet tea. All right, well, I'm a Southerner, and I don't like sweet tea. Well, all true Southerners like sweet tea. Well, what does that mean? That's not valid reasoning. And we see this all the time. No true American would support a policy like that. No true so-and-so would ever do something like this. No real whatever over here would do whatever over. That's not valid. That's not valid reasoning. It doesn't mean anything. You're just making a bad argument that has no basis in actual reality. The straw man fallacy. This is an interesting one. Someone makes an argument. Someone else doesn't like that argument, so they take one small piece of it and set that up as the main argument, shred that one small piece of it, completely ignoring the rest of the argument. That's also fallacious reasoning. That doesn't actually get you anywhere. You're actually attacking a very small piece of a much larger puzzle, while meanwhile leaving the rest of the argument to stand on its own. So technically, you kind of lost that. You used a logical fallacy, so you lost that. The aforementioned correlation does not equal causation. Just because two things correlate to each other, that does not necessitate being an actual correlation. So if you see two things that are very coincidental, that's great. That might be something to even research. Just because it's a coincidence does not mean it's a correlation. So don't make that mistake. One of my favorites is the appeal to authority. Oh, everybody got a big dose of this one in 2020. Let me tell you what. Oh, he's a doctor. Everything he says is absolutely right. What are you? You got a degree in philosophy. You don't know anything. He's a doctor. He said something. It must be true. Does that make it true? I mean, guys, I know a few physicians, when they speak about medicine, they're usually correct. But I've known a lot of them that have talked about other things, and they're so far off. I listened to a physician one night give a lecture on history, and it was the dumbest thing I think I've ever watched in my life. Don't allow, so essentially, don't allow an argument to stand or view an argument as valid or make decisions based on information that you have obtained from someone in a position of authority just because they're in a position of authority. We could look at it like this. So I'm a Freemason. Okay, so maybe I had a bad experience in a lodge and I decided to leave. Maybe I didn't really understand much of what was going on. I didn't really care much. I kind of personally thought it was a little bit satanic. That was the work of the devil, them Masons. Well, so then I went and I got on an internet forum and I started spouting off a whole bunch of stuff about Freemasonry. Well, now somebody who's not a Mason sees all that and they go to someone else who happens to be a Freemason. They're talking to Warren about it. And Warren says, well, man, I don't know where you're really getting all this. This is not the case at all. And that person says, well, I think that it is because it came from a Mason. Well, that's an appeal to authority. That does not make their argument valid. That doesn't add any weight whatsoever to their argument. The fact that that information came from a Mason doesn't mean anything. So don't get caught in that trap. It's a very easy one to get caught into. Everybody wants to listen to the experts. How do you know that they're experts? Did you vet them? Are you qualified to pronounce their level of expertise? It's kind of a tough cookie because you kind of have to do your own research sometimes. You kind of have to put things together. You have to analyze arguments. You have to think about what you're seeing. You can't just take it at face value, and that's what the appeal to authority is all about. And the last one on my list is the false dilemma. Now, this is a big one, and we're actually going to kind of come back to this because this is a large topic of conversation, and it's going to play into our original discussion of faith and reason. Can they coexist? Should they coexist? Come back to that. Now, I do want to take a brief moment to address the idea of skepticism. This plays into the title of the presentation regarding doubt. Everybody knows a skeptic. That one guy doesn't want to believe anything anybody says. Sometimes that can get a little tiring. That's not what we're talking about. A good, healthy, solid skepticism is a wonderful tool to have, and something that I would encourage everyone to have. It defeats gullibility, and it makes sure if you have a question in your mind, if you're willing to think about an idea that you've just come into contact with, give it some actual thought, really look at it, apply doubt, say, this might not be the way that things are. How do I know that this is a valid form of reasoning? You have to subject it to questions. You have to negate. Some philosophers, including my personal favorite philosopher, Jean-Paul Sartre, the famed French 20th century existentialist, discussed this really in great detail and went so far as to even say that the ability to negate is what makes us human. We could not have consciousness without the ability to say no, without the ability to look at something and decide a true value. So a healthy skepticism leads us to a place where we can look at ideas that we come across in our daily lives, perhaps in the lodge, perhaps elsewhere, and we can apply that skepticism to those ideas, and we can decide for ourselves if this is a form of reasoning. Should I pay any attention to this? Why don't we take a look and find out? So that's When we talk about doubt, when we talk about skepticism, when we talk about negation, I'm not speaking of this from the standpoint of a negative. I'll paraphrase our illustrious worshipful master, who brilliantly said just a few moments ago, as a matter of fact, nothing wrong with a good, healthy skepticism. Just most skeptics are dicks. And he might be right about that. So don't let your skepticism go unchecked, but learn how to say no. Learn how to question things. Apply your questioning to everything. Don't take anything just because. Think about it. Whether it's your religion, whether it's your politics, whether it's your social convictions, think about whatever. Apply it to reason. Apply a little bit of doubt. Ask yourself, does this have to be this way? How do I know? Why is this? Why do I believe this? Then you're being a healthy skeptic. And I think that that can be hard to do sometimes when you're dealing with matters of faith, because faith can't be subjected to reason. So now I want to talk a little bit about faith and narrative knowledge, since we've discussed reason and rationality a little bit. So the first and foremost point that I want to make about faith is that it needs no reason. Have you ever read anything by anybody that tried to prove the existence of God? Has anybody ever read any philosophy about any of that? I mean, we're going back to the days when they actually legitimately used to argue about how many angels could dance on the head of a pen. I'm sorry that actually happened, but it did. So there was a long, hundreds-year-long period where philosophers, who we generally think of as intelligent people, tried desperately to logically prove the existence of God, logically prove faith. I have witnessed countless people within faith-based organizations of various and sundry forms and fashions, attempt to use science to justify their faith. And it makes me want to pull all of my considerable amount of hair out of my head. It drives me crazy. You cannot prove faith. If you could prove faith, it wouldn't be faith. If we could prove it, well, then we wouldn't have to have religious debate, would we? There'd only be one religion. It would be the correct religion. We'd know it's the correct religion because you could prove it. Now, some people have tried to do that with science. We'll get into that a little bit later. So the case for faith in a rational world is quite strong. No, it is not rational. It also doesn't need to be rational. And that's an important distinction to make. So faith contributes greatly to our spiritual well-being. Do we have anybody in here strong with faith? Anyone? Hands? Awesome. Rock and roll. Do you feel that because of your faith, whatever it may be, do you feel that your connection to the Almighty is maybe a little bit better, consequently? I would imagine so. I know I do. Would you imagine that because of your sense of faith, your sense of communion with the great architect, however we choose to define him, Masonry makes no calls on it, is greatly strengthened, that it centers you as a person? Because I know that it does me. So, well, that's kind of an interesting idea. I'm up here talking about, I'm just not going to worry about it. I'm up here talking about reason. Now, I have a degree in philosophy. I love philosophy. I love reason. I think mathematics are actually really cool, despite what my 5th grade teacher might have said. So how could I be up here talking about faith and saying, well, it's perfectly fine to go right in with a system completely irrational? Well, we don't need reason. Faith takes us a step further than reason can actually take. Faith fills in all the gaps. Faith bridges that unbridgeable gap between what we can see and observe and that which we feel but cannot prove. So this creates a sense of creativity when exploring new ideas, particularly with a dash of skepticism. You can really go far with that. It provides a sense of wholeness. I went through some years where I was mad at the former faith that I had part of, and I didn't like all the bad things that it had done, and I didn't like all the things in history and blah 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 blah. I ultimately grew out of that, and I ultimately realized that I had drifted so far away from a spiritual center that all I had were facts floating around in my head. It wasn't really a very interesting experience. And it was then that Masonry started to fill in those gaps. And I started to realize some of the things that I had learned years before in my first 3 degrees. And when I began to put those together through a very good and honest study of what we know in the fellowcraft degree as rhetoric and logic, when I started to put those pieces together, I started to find that I drifted closer to a sense of communion with the great architect. I started to find that my soul felt a little more fulfilled when I realized that I don't need to prove these feelings. There's nothing that we have right now that can get us to that point. We don't have any instruments in science that can say, yep, here you go. This is going to get you closer to God. Now, arguably, there might be some things that grow out of the ground that can provide that, but that's not what we're here to discuss tonight. Ask P.D. Newman about that. He'll tell you all about it. Very cool presentation. But there's no mental tools that we can use in a rational sense to get us to that point. So that really makes a great case for faith. I notated in my notes here the senseless futility of proving faith. It's frankly put, it's an idiotic exercise. Don't ever try to prove your faith. Your faith doesn't need to be proven. Subject it to your own questions, whatever questions you have in your heart. Those are perfectly valid for you. They might not be valid for me. They might not be valid for my dad here. They might not be valid for Wes, but they are valid for you. Just because you believe something doesn't necessarily mean that it's right for someone else. Two people can believe wildly opposite things and yet both be correct. It's kind of a weird idea. But as we explore that, as we kind of get into that, as we accept that, then we start to kind of understand why so many faiths, so many religions, so many spiritual convictions can exist simultaneously in the world without killing each other. It's kind of a cool thing, if you ask me. So,
A lot of them do kill each other.
well, a lot of them do, yes, unfortunately. We'll save the controversy for another time, but they don't all kill each other. But yes, some of them do, and that makes me very, very sad. I think the most important thing that I want to touch on here, just when looking at faith, is that you have to bear in mind it's not rational. That means there is no system that can prove it. If there's no system that can prove it, then it's completely subjective, which is fine. That's how it should be. That's what it's meant to be. Every man, every woman's relationship with God is perfectly subjective. And I think that at the end of the day, that's what Masonry is really trying to get home to us, that you don't need an intermediary to get to God. You need only that spark which is in yourself. 32nd degree of the Scotch Rite, we blatantly, in no uncertain terms, tell you this. You are that spark. That spark comes from God and is God in special and limited form manifested. That means, and this is a bit of a departure, but that means as I stand here, as y'all sit here, as our viewers out in viewerland, as we all sit here, we all consider ourselves, we all consider those around us. Every single one of us comes from that same source. Every single one of us is a spark, is a ray of that divine energy. Ergo, you don't need an intermediary. You don't need anyone else to get you in touch with that. You can do that for yourself. And I can't judge what you feel in your heart and what you hear in your head that may be that connection with the divine manifesting itself through you. I can't tell you that you're wrong. Who would I be to do that? You can't tell me that I'm wrong. Those are unbridgeable gaps. And we spend so much time fighting each other over things that can never, ever be proven except to the individual. So why worry about all of that? Only worry about that which is within. And when you start to use your faith, instead of pushing it outward, take it within. Take that faith within. Really consider it. Turn it over. Don't just think about it. Feel it. This is something that reason can't bring. Reason cannot bring emotion or feeling. Occasionally, if you solve a really hard logic problem, okay, you feel pretty good about it. I'm not going to lie. But there are much deeper, much more esoteric feelings that we gain from a spiritual experience, and those can never be reasoned. And those are individual to us. So we have to treat them such. And this is where I think a healthy and wise faith really begins to build the soul, really begins to help us chip away the rough edges of that rough ashlar so that we can smooth ourselves out, make ourselves into a block for that temple not made with hands. So this has kind of all danced around one central question. Can reason and faith actually coexist? My answer is absolutely, emphatically, absolutely, and they should. Masonry teaches us this in the Fellowcraft degree through the 7 liberal arts and sciences. And just as a brief aside, can anybody name the 7 liberal arts and sciences? Ooh, I didn't think so. Can you? Bring it.
Grammar, rhetoric, logic, mathematics, geometry, astronomy, and music.
Ladies and gentlemen, gentlemen, he's the worshipful master for a reason. When you think of reason and faith, oftentimes people will say, well, they don't mix at all. It's like oil and water. Okay, that's true. Oil and water don't mix at all. I don't want you all to think about reason and faith like oil and water. I want you to think about reason and faith more like oil and vinegar. Y'all ever had a good Italian sub with oil and vinegar? Oh, it's like the best thing in the world. You can use it as salad dressing. It's amazing. It enhances so many things. Does the oil mix with the vinegar? No, it does not. Does the oil work really well with the vinegar? Oh, yeah. Yeah, so don't think of reason and faith like oil and water. Think of it like oil and vinegar. Two things that are separate, little opposite, but can work together. So through a multitude of generational misunderstandings of these ideas on faith and reason, we have kind of allowed ourselves as a people, and I'm going to include the whole world into this because to the best of my knowledge, there's not a country out there which predicates itself on its amazing ability to reason. I wish there was. I'd move there. That'd be cool. But there's not. So over the generations, we have lost a lot of that. I don't think that we think anymore. I don't think that we've truly taught our kids and young adults to think in so long that there's probably nobody living currently, maybe like some 107-year-old fella somewhere, that actually remembers when logic and rhetoric and grammar, for that matter, were actually taught prior to college, prior to a university setting. This is really not great. We have become victim in so many respects to what I like to call grand false dilemma. I told you we were going to come back to false dilemmas. So the false dilemma exists when you set up two opposite ideas and you create a dialectic out of it without any room whatsoever for the middle ground. You completely shun the middle ground. You say, well, let's just look at a great example of it. Let's say, try not to get too controversial, but just jump in. Say you're a big conservative, and no, you don't even have to be a big conservative. You can just be a moderate. So then you're talking to somebody who's really far left, and you tell them, well, I'm really not so much a fan of, what so-and-so in politics is doing or saying right now. I don't think that's good for the country. And then that person is met with, yeah, well, Trump didn't do any better. Oh, God, it hurts my brain so much. Now, the person who made such a ridiculous concept has immediately made a lot of assumptions. chiefly being that this person, who they may or may not know anything about, supported one political candidate. Well, I mean, that's maybe not true at all. Said person's a moderate. Maybe they didn't even vote. Maybe if they did, they voted third party. The other person says, oh, well, you must have, all you conservatives are just all the same. Well, this person's not really a conservative. They're kind of in the middle. This person just made a whole big assumption. This person just committed the false dilemma fallacy. They said, if you are not this, then you must be this. Well, guys, very, very seldomly in life is that the case. There is always a middle ground. Unless we're talking binary, on and off. Okay, fine. There's no middle ground there. There's not like a off 0.5. That doesn't exist. But so seldom is that the case in our daily interactions. We often find ourselves stuck in this dialectic reasoning. And this is one. Now, here's a controversial statement for some of you. I don't hate Karl Marx. I don't think he was the best philosopher. I don't think his conclusions were particularly great, but Marx wasn't really out to do that. Marx was out to provide a critique of 19th century capitalism and try to spitball some great ideas to try to, come up with a new political system. Well, one of the things that Marx really harped on was what he called the dialectic. Now, the dialectic is an interesting concept, and it can be used effectively by somebody that knows what they're doing. His dialectic was separated into the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the rich people and the poor people. Well, I could make an argument for Marx in his defense that back then you might could divvy people up like that. It wasn't exactly the fairest of systems back then. It wasn't the greatest iteration of capitalism the world has ever seen, that's for sure. But people have run with that. They've taken that. They've sprinted off the track, and now everything is either this or that. You like this, or if you like this, then you don't like that. If you think this way, then you don't think that way. If you don't think that way, well, then you think this way. This is all completely stupid, y'all. And we live in a day and age where that is the going mentality. Everything is dialectic. Everything is split right down the middle. It's blue and red. It's Republican and Democrat. It's Christian and Satan. Everything has this ridiculous dualism to it that absolutely overrules any sense of middle ground, any sense where any other rational outcome could be had. So one of the ways to do this, or one of the ways to illustrate the false dilemma, arguing reason against faith. I mean, that's not really that doesn't work for aforementioned reasons. It's always doomed to fail. Not working with the same tools or even agreeing on terms. You think about this. How many times have you seen people get into an argument and they're getting heated and they're really going at it? And after maybe 15, 20 minutes, they both figure out that they're kind of saying the same thing. They're just differing a little bit on emphasis. Yeah, you could avoid that immediately by simply using some reason tools, using some logic tools, defining your terms before you start arguing. You might think you're talking about apples, but in reality, I'm talking about oranges and you're talking about pears. And if you're using the wrong language, if you haven't sat down to define your terms, then you're gonna fail miserably. So those of faith, and this is an important concept. This is a hard one for a lot of people. Those of faith must accept reasonable conclusions about the world. Let me show you what I mean. Let me see a show of hands, seriously, of all the people in this room who really believe that the earth is flat. Okay, cool. I'm strengthened. My soul is strengthened. Warren's coming to get you if you do raise your hand. Amazingly, there are a great number of people who actually believe this now. It's kind of mind-blowing. They have utterly abandoned reason and have chosen to have faith in some weird idea because they have also chosen to have faith in the notion that the government has been lying to us. Well, of course the government's been lying to us, but who knows about what the hell they're lying about? Because if we knew that, then, well, would they really be lying about it? Anyway, that's beside the point. And looking at a situation like that, these people are not aware of the assumptions that they're making. They're assuming that all the information that they found in the bowels of the internet is factual. That's kind of bad. They're assuming that all the information, therefore, from anyone saying anything else is infactual, is not real. So they're assuming that. They're assuming that all of these other people are absolutely lying. It's kind of a whole big box of ridiculousness when you start peeling it all back. So from that perspective, and let's just also say, those of faith must accept reasonable conclusions about the world. Also, I have known very many hardcore religious people, and not just of the Christian church, but of many different churches, many different religions, that are so caught up with what their book says to believe that they will absolutely, vehemently dispute very, very, very difficult to dispute empirical data. Radiocarbon dating. It's been around for a long time. I know people that know how to do this. The science is very sound. But we still have people that actually believe the world is only 6,000 years old. I mean, that's fine. If anybody wants to do that, that's great. But you shouldn't expect anyone else to be of that same opinion because it's not reasonable. You have to kind of have a certain amount of maturity with your own faith that you can say, I don't care what anybody else believes. This is what I believe. No one else has to believe it. I'm comfortable. A lot of people can't do that. They think that the whole world must believe as they believe. Otherwise, the whole world is also wrong. It drives me nuts, guys. Those without faith must accept the right of the faithful to their own convictions. If you're talking to somebody who is a person of faith, and you are just constantly trying to disprove their faith using nothing but reason, you've already failed, and you've also annoyed someone. So it's best to kind of give that a pass. Scientists and such, and this is hard for them to do. They kind of have to accept that some people choose not to buy into all of that, and they have their own ideas. They have their own ways of thinking that don't need to be proven to anyone for them to have a fulfilled and hopefully successful existence. But that does not stop people from trying to consistently force this. So when reason and faith are allowed to exist together, however, remember oil and vinegar, when reason and faith are allowed to exist together and are both fostered in a mind that says, the world I live in, the world of facticity, works on rational principles. But we don't know everything. There are bits that cannot be explained. There are bits that are ineffable. So I am going to make a leap of faith towards what I feel and what I believe is a step towards God, a step towards wholeness, a step towards the great architect. That will immediately begin to create a sense of spiritual fulfillment within your heart, within your mind. So when they are both fostered together and are both, when they exist together and are both fostered, a Mason can appreciate the ever-changing landscape of scientific cosmology whilst cultivating a sense of oneness with the creative source, the divine light that exists as the source of all faiths. And I can't speak for every Mason, but I do believe that Masonry 100% teaches us that all faiths are but mankind seeing through a mirror darkly. That singular source, that singular conscious expression of totality, of completeness, that is God. That God speaks to all people in a way that they must be spoken to in order to hear the message. For some people, that's Christianity. For other people, that's Judaism. For some, that's Hinduism or Shintoism or Taoism. Many, many, many different paths to the source. It's important for us as Masons to try to remember that so that we can promote tolerance, so that we can respect those who think differently than we do, while still being able to have intelligent and thought-provoking conversation with them about any and all subjects. We must learn that tolerance for those who operate within different faiths and should promote equally a healthy respect for all things rational. So faith and reason exist together. Yes, they absolutely can. Yes, they absolutely should. And if you find yourself lacking in any one of those, just look to the open doors of the lodge and it will fill you in. We are admonished to discuss the 7 liberal arts and sciences. Masonry would not make a thing out of that if it did not want us to be reasonable, rational men. As a rational and accountable being, in whom do you put your trust? Exactly. Can you prove God? No. Masonry is straight up telling us that reason and faith must work together and that we should be cultivating both. So that would be my challenge to every person viewing this presentation, to find ways that you can incorporate a healthy sense of reason, a healthy sense of skepticism, and a healthy sense of faith in the great unknown. Put it all together, mix it all up, and come up with what you can come up with. Everyone's going to be different, and that's okay. That's how it should be. And with that, I will open the floor to any possible questions.
I have a question.
Go right ahead.
About logical fallacies.
Mhm.
Do you believe that there are some circumstances where these can benefit society?
I would say that in the sense that learning what not to do is beneficial, yes. Arguing using a logical fallacy means you have already lost the argument. You just don't know it.
I was thinking, because in particular, the one about authority,
Mm-hmm.
like it seems like if you had a society of benevolent leaders and people, trusting those people and being led in the right direction, it would save people a lot of time and it would actually benefit society.
You could, and in this instance, we're not talking about really matters of practicality or allowing experts to be experts and do what they do. It's more judging an argument. Yeah, so like if someone wants to say, you have to listen to this. This is right. Well, why is it right? Well, because so and so said it, and so is an expert in the field. Well, okay, that may be, but that's not valid reasoning. So, yeah, tell me why his argument's correct. Piece it together, show it, diagram it. Let me see why his reasoning works. The fact that he's an expert or not an expert. And I should have touched on the opposite to that. You can have somebody that's an absolute layperson, and yet they can make an argument, a sophisticated argument even, that is perfectly valid, absolutely true. You could diagram it and get a tautology. And if you said, well, you can't listen to that because this person, they don't know anything. They're just a layperson. They don't know what they're talking about. That's equally an appeal to authority.
What's something that we could do every day, like an exercise or practice to work our reasoning faculties?
I would definitely recommend to start with researching informal logic. Take it up to formal symbolic logic if you want to, but that stuff gets heady. I would recommend just a good cursory knowledge of informal logic and critical thinking. There's 1,000,010 textbooks on the subject. Actually, there's some. What I have found is that when dealing with information online, there's like a scale that I subject it to. What can this information do? Leotard called it the performative criterion. How well does this information perform? Like, what practicality does it have? And if the performative criterion is through the roof, like politics, probably being the biggest one, I don't trust any of it. But if its performative criterion is actually pretty low, like nobody can really do anything with this except it's like the information is only valuable just for what it is. You can't do anything with it. Maybe you can learn a skill. Like I'm not going to question Bach sheet music that I pulled up on the internet. Who's going to mess with that? Same thing with logic. So you can find a lot of great resources on the internet. The Stanford Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy is a really good place. So you can start getting into that. You can learn forms of valid argumentation, modus ponens, modus tollens. You can learn some of the invalid arguments, and you can start getting accustomed to being able to spot that in real life arguments. And then all you got to do is just pay attention to pop culture for 5 minutes and you'll find 40 of them. So they're all over, particularly the false dilemma. Deb?
Yeah, Ryan, do you think that the culture today, at least the Western culture today, has been groomed and conditioned to look at social problems from an emotional perspective?
Yes. Social problems from an emotional perspective gets votes. Jeff?
I'm a little taken back by your whole premise of faith not requiring rationality.
Mhm.
If it doesn't require rationality, then what's the difference, especially with the whole pluralistic context you've given it, between faith and imagination?
Jeff, that's a great question. So in large part, I would almost argue that a lot of faith is akin to imagination. We are using our minds to construct scenarios that cannot be rationally proven.
If you were to talk to theologians and apologists around the world from all walks of life,
Mhm.
they would all point to patterns that are evident. The sun always rises.
Ah.
You have faith, the sun will always rise. It always does. But my understanding of that isn't a requirement.
Mhm.
But I'm not being irrational.
No. Well, and actually going back to the sun rising argument, that's my prime example of inductive reasoning, which actually is rational. Now, making an extrapolation based on the sun rising every morning and saying that is the sun god who is rising every morning to intentionally grace us with solar radiation that will cause the plants to grow and cause us to absorb vitamin D and cause day. Now that's a leap of faith. That cannot be proven. As far as the patterns, and you know me well enough to know that I absolutely agree with that. There are patterns everywhere. They have to mean something, but what do they mean?
Isn't that faith? Faith being the recognition of the pattern?
No, I don't think that's the recognition of the pattern. It's what we do with the recognition of the pattern.
Wouldn't that be logic?
Could be, might also not be.
Reason would be then what you do with that logic.
Yep. Now here's the thing though. With those patterns, what conclusions are we drawing? Are we drawing naturalistic conclusions based on observable data? Because if that's the case, then we are looking at science.
But you said it's holistic. That's why we have all these religions. They're all seeing the evidence of the God,
Mhm.
but all having different experiences.
Yeah.
The experiences are evident. The explanations are very different. They all have faith, but
Yeah.
their logic and reasoning is very different.
Yeah, I would say so. And again, I would caution against using reason or logic to start getting into faith. I mean, there are applications for that within a large organized system, of course. But at the end of the day, you just can't get back to the real meat and potatoes. Prove to me that there's a heaven. Prove it. Prove it. Prove to me that you have a guardian angel. Prove to me that Moses did all the things in the Old Testament that he did. Prove to me that what's another? Prove to me that Muhammad really was channeling the essence of God and wasn't just completely crazy.
And yet there should be ways to do that by looking at other spiritual texts around the world, by looking at historical accounts of Moses. Talking about a sun god, that one's a little bit of a stretch. It's more like mythology.
Yeah.
We see the patterns and we're trying to assimilate a logic around it with whatever we have in our faculties. But to say that faith is absent or does not require rationality, I would say you just have your rationality.
I'm not sure that I agree, and I'm gonna ask you a question. What is the difference between faith and mythology?
Mythology is man describing man's experience of the divine.
Mhm.
Whereas faith is just recognizing the patterns. It's kind of like, faith and truth are kind of synonymous in a way. It keeps showing up in this fractal universe in various contexts.
Mhm.
We don't, and most religions are debating the presence of the divine, because the evidence is evident, but their mythology around it, their experience of it, and how they develop a logic and then a consequential reasoning around it is very different. And that's why people have trouble believing in a Joseph Smith as opposed to Jesus or Muhammad or shoot, we've got Shiva.
Yeah, for sure, absolutely. So, gosh, while you were talking, I hit on an excellent point, and it just vanished from my head, sadly. But I think let's look at. So, okay, you mentioned that the evident that you mentioned that the existence of God is evident and is all around us, and that is what the theologians, that is what the shamans, that is what anyone with that kind of spiritual mindset is looking at. How is it evident? What is not evident to the atheist? Why do we have?
I would argue the atheist is one of the most spiritual of all.
Is
What
he?
the atheist is saying
Do
is
tell.
not that I don't believe in God, but rather I don't believe in any representation of God that's being put forth. It does not resonate as true for me. Some of those spiritual people I've met have been atheists.
I would agree with that, but that is not always the case. I know many atheists who completely reject any sense of spirituality whatsoever. It's not real. It's none of it's there. All of this is just chemical reactions in our heads that engender hormonal responses, and that makes us feel a certain way. But none of it's real. So how could two people then come to the same conclusion if, in fact, the existence of God was evident?
I think the fact that the atheist rejects the notion of the divine means that they have some sense of what the divine would be if there was one.
Perhaps, but most of those people that I know that have rejected it have rejected the third-party guy sitting on a white cloud wearing a toga.
Exactly.
Which I mean, yeah, I think that's not the way that I look at the great architect. But I do know plenty of people that would absolutely argue that there is nothing that denotes the evidence of any kind of almighty or spiritual being. But that therein lies a great debate. And again, that's why I'm saying that if you try to apply logic as an apologist for a faith, it's just going to fall apart because the faith at the end of the day doesn't need the logic. It can't have the logic. Otherwise it wouldn't be faith. I mean, like if you could write an equation that proved it all.
Right. Well, my point was,
Yeah.
if you say that faith doesn't require rationality,
Mhm.
then you just have your rationality.
Maybe, okay, so let's drill down into the semantics. You could apply rationality to it, but not necessarily formal logic. And I'm using reason in the sense of reason being the study of logic, the study of rhetoric. Reason being moving from one concept, like formulating a premise, formulating another premise, combining those premises, looking at what all of that implies and drawing a conclusion therefore. You can use that practice in faith, but as soon as you take it into the world of faith, you have to play by a different set of rules. It's no longer exactly, whereas you're using the logical process, it's not exactly logic anymore. Or at least it's not.
Many logics. There's many
True. Let's draw the difference between logic and science then. You cannot use science to get at that, at least not with any tools that we currently have. That may be a thing in the future. Yeah.
We got one more. Question time for one more. We got to go eat.
Okay, sounds good.
I hate to be, standing to conclude everything, but my personal opinion is that I believe there is evidence of faith, and I think that evidence is energy. When you look at the first law of thermodynamics, energy cannot be created or destroyed. Energy is in everything. So, the universe was created with a Big Bang. So
Possibly.
Possibly, yeah. That's what the Bible tells us, but nobody's actually there to see it. So.
Yeah.
So if that is indeed the case, I would suggest to you that there's nothing but God. There can be nothing but God based on that.
Well, and I also happen to be of that same persuasion. I call it the monistic universe, where there is but one substance, and that one substance manifested itself as all substances, which is very much in alignment with what Masonry teaches, very much in alignment with what the Scottish Rite, particularly the 32nd degree, is, as Ryan will soon be able to tell us in great detail. Shameless plug for the Scottish Rite. If there's any non-Scottish Rite Masons here, put in your petitions. There's still time. It's great. You'll love it. I promise. Moving on. I absolutely agree that you can definitely get at all that. It's faith comes in when you start drawing the conclusions from that. So, but yeah, that's a very good point. Thanks.
So now everyone who is on YouTube watching is going to claim that the Freemasons are, despite watching that entire presentation, they're going to get that Freemasons are part of hiding the fact that the world is flat. So, thanks for that. But with that,
Happy to be.
I'm going to end the live stream. We'll say a prayer real quick, and then we'll eat.